It did not begin with Jacob's first cry, nor with Esau's first breath, but with years of silence stretching over the tents of Isaac and Rebekah, a silence heavy enough to make every prayer feel like it was disappearing into an empty sky. Isaac, the promised son of Abraham, the child of miracle, had grown old enough to marry, to build a household, to carry the covenant forward. But his wife remained barren, and every passing season seemed to whisper the same cruel question. Where is the God who promised? Yet Isaac did not turn away. He carried his ache into the presence of the Lord. And Scripture says simply, almost quietly, that he prayed for his wife, and the Lord answered him. What had been emptiness became expectancy. What had been silence was suddenly filled with life, for Rebekah conceived. But the miracle that filled her womb did not come in peace, because from the very beginning, there was a war inside her. The movements in her body were not the gentle rolling of unborn children. They were violent, insistent, as if two unseen forces were colliding in a battleground no one else could see. Day after day, the struggle intensified until Rebekah could no longer bear it. And in her confusion and pain, she cried out, "If it is like this, why is this happening to me?" She did what the faithful always do when reality makes no sense. She went to inquire of the Lord. And the Lord did not answer her with comfort, but with prophecy. 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger. With those words, God pulled back the curtain of time and revealed that what Rebekah felt as turmoil in her own body was actually the beginning of a story that would shape the destiny of the world. These were not just 2 brothers competing for affection. They were 2 nations, 2 ways of living, 2 lines of history that would forever run in tension with one another. And in a world where the firstborn always ruled, where the elder always stood above the younger, God quietly declared that he would overturn the pattern. The older would serve the younger, and his covenant line would flow not through the child the world expected, but through the one he himself chose. When the time came for the children to be born, the prophecy began to take on flesh and face and name. The first child emerged red, his skin ruddy, his body covered in so much hair that he looked like he was already wrapped in the thick garment, a wild, primal strength already written on his tiny frame. They named him Esau, a name that would forever be associated with the open country, the hunt, the raw energy of a man who belonged to the field more than to the tent. But the birth was not over. As Esau was pulled into the light of day, a second hand appeared, a small, determined hand, clenched around his brother's heel as if refusing to let him go. As if even in that first moment of existence, he was trying to pull Esau back, to drag himself forward, to refuse the order that nature seemed to impose. It was not just a strange medical detail. It was a sign, a living symbol of a destiny that would be marked by grasping, striving, contending. Because of that moment, the second child was named Jacob, the heel grabber, the supplanter, the one who takes another's place, a name that would become both his greatest scandal and his deepest transformation. The boys grew, and as their bodies changed, so did the distance between them. Esau became exactly what his birth had suggested, a skillful hunter, a man of the open country, whose strength belonged to the wild fields, whose identity was tied to speed, instinct, and the chase. He smelled of earth and sweat and wild game, and his father Isaac loved him for it, delighting in the taste of the meat he brought home, seeing in Esau perhaps the kind of rugged masculinity the world admires. Jacob, on the other hand, was different, a man of the tents, a quiet presence who lived not under the blazing sun of the open fields, but in the shaded spaces of the camp. While Esau chased animals, Jacob watched people. While Esau hunted with a bow, Jacob learned to navigate with words, with timing, with an intense awareness of weakness and opportunity. The scripture compresses this into a simple contrast. But beneath that contrast lies a deep psychological divide. One brother lived by impulse, the other by calculation. One moved outward, the other moved inward. And, as often happens in fractured families, the parents chose sides. Isaac favored Esau, and Rebekah favored Jacob. And the house that had once echoed with unanswered prayers now began to echo with unspoken tensions. Then, one seemingly ordinary day, the hidden fault line between the two brothers finally cracked open. Esau came in from the open country exhausted, his energy spent, his hunger roaring louder than any sense of long-term consequence. Jacob, meanwhile, stood over a pot of red stew, the air heavy with the smell of lentils and spices, the kind of scent that grabs hold of a starving man's mind and refuses to let go. Esau's request was simple, almost pathetic in its urgency. "Let me have some of that red stew. I am famished." And in that moment, what God had spoken to Rebekah in secret began to unfold in public. Jacob saw the weakness. He saw the hunger. He saw the opportunity. "First, sell me your birthright." In one sentence, the quiet man of the tents revealed the sharp edge of his character. He was not just a passive homebody. He was a strategist, a man who knew the weight of the birthright, the double portion of inheritance, the leadership of the family, the spiritual line of promise. And he was willing to leverage his brother's immediate hunger to seize what his hands could not naturally claim. Esau, living fully in the urgent present, replied with a tragic short-sightedness that would define him. "Look, I am about to die. What good is the birthright to me?" And with an oath spoken between brothers, Esau sold what had eternal weight for something that could be swallowed in a few minutes. Jacob gave him bread and stew. Esau ate, drank, got up, and left. And Scripture sums up the entire exchange with one chilling verdict. So Esau despised his birthright. On the surface, it was just a bowl of soup shared between brothers at the end of a long day. But in the unseen realm, a line had been crossed, a blessing had begun to shift, and the pattern of their lives was now set on a collision course with the purposes of God. The struggle that began in Rebekah's womb had now stepped into history. Esau, the man of the field, had traded destiny for appetite. Jacob, the man of the tents, had taken his first step into a path of grasping and contending that would one day drive him to wrestle, not just with men, but with God himself. There are moments in the biblical story when the air thickens, when every sound seems to carry a prophetic weight, when the very fabric of a household is pulled taut because destiny is about to break open. And in the twilight of Isaac's life, when his eyes had grown dim and the world around him had blurred into shifting shadows, such a moment arrived. The old patriarch, sensing the nearness of death, summoned his firstborn Esau, the rugged hunter he loved with a tenderness shaped by years of shared meals and the wild aroma of the open fields. He asked for one last hunt, one final bowl of savory meat, so that he might lay his hands upon his favored son and release the covenant blessing that had passed from Abraham to him, and now must pass again. But what Isaac spoke softly to Esau did not remain hidden. Rebekah, the woman who had once carried a prophecy inside her womb like a burning coal, heard every word. She had felt the war between her sons before they ever opened their eyes. She remembered God's decree that the older would serve the younger, and she recognized in Isaac's private request the threat of reversing the divine order. And so, driven by a fierce loyalty to the son God had chosen, and by a courage sharpened over years of discernment, she moved swiftly into action, pulling Jacob into a plan where deceit and destiny would intertwine so tightly that they could never again be separated. Jacob hesitated, not because he doubted the purpose, but because he feared the consequences. Esau was hairy, he was smooth. Esau bore the scent of the wilderness. Jacob smelled of tents and cooking fires. Esau moved with confidence, Jacob with quiet calculation. "What if my father touches me?" he asked, aware that a single misstep could bring not blessing, but curse. But Rebekah, with eyes fixed on a future only she seemed to understand, answered, "Let the curse fall on me," and with those words sealed both the plan and her own place in the unfolding drama. The preparations began with almost ceremonial intensity. Rebekah took Esau's garments, the ones still carrying the scent of earth and wild game, and draped them over Jacob's shoulders. She covered his arms and the smooth skin of his neck with goatskins so that touch might deceive what sight could not. She prepared the meal Isaac loved, a meal weighted not only with flavor, but with the future. And then she placed everything into Jacob's trembling hands, sending him into his father's tent like a man walking into a storm from which he could not return. Jacob entered, and the darkness inside was thick, almost sacred. "My father," he said, and Isaac, hearing a voice he knew too well, asked, "Who are you, my son?" Jacob answered with a boldness that tasted of both fear and inevitability. "I am Esau, your firstborn." Isaac questioned how the hunt had been completed so quickly, and Jacob invoked the name of God. "The Lord your God granted me success," a statement that carried the unsettling weight of truth wrapped in deception. Still uncertain, Isaac called Jacob near. His failing hands touched the goat skins on Jacob's arms. His ears heard Jacob's voice. His senses wavered between familiar tones and convincing textures, until he whispered a line that has lingered through centuries. "The voice is Jacob's, but the hands are Esau's." In that fragile tension between doubt and belief, between failing sight and deceptive touch, the blessing was spoken. Isaac ate, drank, drew Jacob close, breathed in the scent of Esau's clothes on Jacob's borrowed skin, and then unleashed words that would shape the destiny of nations. "May God give you the dew of heaven and the richness of the earth. May nations serve you and peoples bow down to you. Be Lord over your brothers, and may those who curse you be cursed, and those who bless you be blessed." With those words, the covenant shifted, the prophecy took form, and the spiritual axis of the family turned irrevocably toward Jacob. But blessings, especially stolen ones, do not fall quietly. When Esau returned and learned what had happened, the wilderness inside him broke into a roar of anguish, so deep that the ground itself seemed to tremble beneath his cry. The hunter who feared nothing now burned with a single desire: to kill the brother who had taken everything from him. And thus the blessing that made Jacob the heir also made him a fugitive, setting in motion a journey that would eventually lead him not only into exile, but into the very hands of God himself. Jacob fled into the wilderness under a sky that felt colder than it should, carrying nothing but a staff in his hand and the weight of a fractured family on his shoulders. Behind him was Esau's rage, burning hot enough to swallow a man whole. Before him lay the long, uncertain road toward Haran, the land of his mother's kin, a land he had never seen, yet was now his only refuge. Each step Jacob took seemed to echo with memories of deception and blessing, of a father's trembling hands and a brother's anguished cry. And though the desert stretched wide around him, he could not escape the truth that he was now a man caught between promise and exile. When night came, it settled heavily upon him, not as a gentle friend, but as a vast, indifferent curtain drawing shut. With no tent, no servants, no comfort but the darkness itself, Jacob found a stone for his head and lay down under the cold, indifferent stars. His body was exhausted, yet his mind churned. Fear of Esau, sorrow for what he had done, questions about the God who had spoken destiny through stolen blessing. And it was there, in the loneliness of the desert floor, where no human voice could reach him, that heaven tore open. He dreamed, and in the dream a ladder stood upon the earth, its top piercing the very heights of the sky, stretching into realms where human sight dissolves and eternity begins. Angels, terrifying and radiant, beings woven from light and flame, were ascending and descending upon it, moving with a purpose that made Jacob feel smaller than the dust beneath him. And above the ladder, above the swirling movement of heaven's messengers, stood the Lord himself, speaking not judgment, but promise. The land Jacob lay upon would one day belong to his descendants. His offspring would spread like the dust of the earth. All nations would be blessed through him. And perhaps most astonishing of all, I am with you. I will not leave you. Jacob awoke with a kind of fear that feels like awe, with breath caught in his throat and his skin trembling as if still touched by the light of the dream. He whispered into the silence, "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it." And in that confession lay the beginning of his transformation. He took the stone he had slept upon, set it upright like a pillar, poured oil upon it, and named the place Bethel, the house of God, because for the first time in his wandering life, the presence of heaven had broken through the barren landscape of his exile. With renewed resolve, Jacob continued his journey eastward until the hills gave way to pasture lands and wells, signs that he was nearing Haran. At a well outside the city, he saw a group of shepherds waiting for others to gather before they would roll away the heavy stone covering the water. Jacob approached them, asked of his mother's family, and before long heard a name that made his pulse quicken: Laban. And as he was still speaking, Destiny stepped quietly into view. She came leading her father's sheep, moving with the grace of someone familiar with both labor and sunlight. And Jacob's world seemed to still. Rachel, daughter of Laban, granddaughter of Nahor, stood before him, a figure so striking in beauty and presence that Scripture wastes no words describing anything else. Something fierce and unexpected surged within Jacob, a strength he did not know still lived in him. He strode to the well, rolled away the massive stone by himself, a stone that normally required many men, and watered Rachel's flock, as though serving her were as natural as breathing. And then, overwhelmed by a mixture of joy, relief, exhaustion, and something deeper that words could not yet name, Jacob kissed her, an innocent greeting by the customs of the East, and lifted his voice and wept. Perhaps he wept because after running from death, he had unexpectedly found life. Perhaps he wept because after the loneliness of Bethel, he had suddenly found belonging. Or perhaps he wept because in Rachel's eyes he recognized the first glimmer of a future not built on deceiving or being deceived, but on love. Rachel ran to tell her father, and Laban, hearing that his sister's son had arrived, came rushing out with open arms, embracing Jacob with warmth and welcome. Jacob entered his house, told him everything, and Laban, seeing both the promise and the usefulness of this new relative, declared, "Surely you are my own bone and flesh," and welcomed him to stay. Thus Jacob began a new chapter of his pilgrimage, not as a fugitive in fear, but as a worker in a foreign land, unaware that before long he would meet the very man who could match him trick for trick, cunning for cunning, and that through trials, love, and struggle, God would slowly turn the heel grabber into a man worthy of bearing an entire nation's name. And yet, beneath all the human motions, the fleeing, the dreaming, the weeping, the loving, one truth pulsed like a quiet heartbeat. The God of Bethel was still guiding him, weaving Jacob's wandering path toward a destiny far greater than anything he could imagine. When Jacob first stepped into Laban's household, he did not know that the man who embraced him with open arms was one who carried two faces: hospitality on the surface, calculation underneath. Nor did he know that the journey, which began with a kiss of innocent affection at the well, would soon lead him into one of the most emotionally tangled and spiritually formative chapters of his life. For though Jacob had fled the deception he committed against Esau, in Haran he would encounter a deceiver far more seasoned than himself, a man whose smile hid schemes and whose generosity always served his own advantage. From the moment Jacob saw Rachel, the younger daughter of Laban, walking toward the well with the sun settling like a crown upon her hair, he had loved her with a love that seemed to rise from some deep place he had not known existed. And so, when Laban asked what wages he desired, Jacob answered with a devotion that startled even the shepherds who overheard him. He would serve 7 long years, 7 years of labor under the heat of the eastern sun, 7 years of tending flocks not his own, 7 years of waiting, if only he might receive Rachel as his wife. And Scripture, with a tenderness rarely used of men, says that those 7 years felt to him like a few days because of his love for her. But love, even the purest kind, does not shield a man from treachery. When the 7 years came to their close, Jacob approached Laban with a heart full of hope and urgency, asking for his bride so that their union might finally be complete. Laban agreed, prepared a feast, called the men of the place, and filled the night with celebration. Yet behind the curtains of festivity, he wove a deception so bold and so violating that even Jacob, the master of disguises, did not foresee it. In the darkness of the wedding chamber, veiled and silent, Laban brought not Rachel, but Leah. Years passed in the household of Laban, years filled with labor, conflict, blessing, and unspoken wounds. And through it all, Jacob became a man transformed, not only by love and hardship, but by the persistent hand of God resting upon him. His flocks multiplied, his children grew, and the once penniless fugitive became a man whose tents stretched wide across the plains of Haran. Yet prosperity cannot silence destiny, and one day, in the quiet weight of divine presence, the Lord spoke to him with a voice that felt like both command and invitation. "Return to the land of your fathers, and I will be with you." Those words, though rich with promise, fell upon Jacob like a double-edged sword. For to return home meant to face the one truth he had outrun for decades: Esau, the brother whose blessing he had taken, whose cry of shattered betrayal still echoed across the years, whose rage had once burned hot enough to vow murder. The road to Canaan was not merely a journey across deserts and valleys. It was a journey back into the consequences of his own past, back into the shadows he had left behind. And though Jacob had wrestled with Laban's greed and survived, the thought of facing Esau shook him in a way no earthly adversary ever had. As Jacob moved his household toward the borders of his homeland, the invisible weight in his chest grew heavier with each mile. Messengers were sent ahead with trembling urgency, instructed to tell Esau that Jacob was returning not as a rival, not as a conqueror, but as a servant, carrying gifts and submission. When the messengers returned, their report crushed what little confidence Jacob had managed to gather. Esau was coming to meet him, accompanied by 400 men. The number alone was enough to freeze the blood in his veins. 400 was not a welcoming party. It was an army. Suddenly, the night seemed colder, the desert more unforgiving, and the years of blessing in Haran felt painfully fragile as Jacob confronted the possibility that everything he loved, wives, children, servants, flocks, might be swept away by the wrath of a brother he once wronged. Fear, that old familiar shadow, rose like a storm inside him. He divided his people into 2 companies, hoping that if Esau attacked one, the other might escape. It was a desperate strategy formed by a man who had run out of cleverness, out of strength, out of illusions about his own control. To soften Esau's heart, Jacob arranged an extravagant procession of gifts: goats, rams, camels, cows, donkeys. Waves of wealth released like a river of apology flowing toward the brother whose forgiveness he could not demand, but desperately hoped to earn. Each group of servants was given the same message. They belong to your servant Jacob, and he is behind us. It was as if Jacob were layering humility upon humility, sending not just livestock, but confessions, regrets, pleas for mercy, all wrapped in the language of honor and submission. Yet even after the gifts were sent, fear remained, a fear so deep it hollowed him from the inside. That night, standing beside the dark waters of the Jabbok, Jacob looked at his wives and children, his servants and possessions, and felt the crushing truth that he could protect none of them. He crossed them over the river, one by one, placing them on the farther bank, as if distance could shield them from the storm that might break at dawn. And when the last of them had disappeared into the darkness, Jacob found himself alone, utterly, devastatingly alone, with only his breath, his past, and his terror. In that moment, Jacob was no longer the clever schemer who had outwitted Esau, Isaac, and Laban. He was a man stripped of defenses, stripped of illusions. A man who realized that all the blessings of the past decades, herds, wives, children, wealth, could not save him from Esau's sword, nor from the consequences of his own actions. Exhaustion pressed down upon him like a physical weight, and the wilderness around him seemed to echo the condition of his soul. Empty, trembling, waiting. He had reached the end of his strength, the end of his strategies, the end of himself. And it was precisely there, at the lowest point of fear and helplessness, that Jacob was about to encounter the one who had been pursuing him all along, the one who would not let him return to Canaan as the man he used to be. Night had fallen over the valley of the Jabbok, a night heavy with the kind of darkness that seems to swallow sound and blur the line between earth and sky. The river whispered its cold song as it wound through the rocks, and Jacob, having sent his wives, his children, and every possession across the water, stood alone on the near bank, wrapped not in silence, but in the crushing weight of his own fear. He was a man who had outrun his brother, outsmarted his uncle, and outmaneuvered nearly every obstacle life had set before him. Yet now, on the eve of meeting Esau and the army of 400 men, all his cleverness, all his schemes, all his strength had collapsed like a dying flame. For the first time in his life, Jacob faced a future he could not manipulate, and it terrified him. As he lingered in the shadows, exhaustion pulling at his bones, a presence stepped toward him, quietly, without announcement, without warning. Scripture calls him simply a man, but nothing about him was ordinary. He moved like someone who knew the weight of eternity, and when he laid his hand upon Jacob, the world itself seemed to hold its breath. Without a word, the stranger seized him, and Jacob, startled, overwhelmed, reacted with the instinct of a man who had fought his entire life. He grappled back. What followed was not a scuffle, not a brief collision of bodies, but a battle that stretched through the depths of the night. Two figures locked together like shadows wrestling beneath the moon, straining, gasping, struggling upon the cold earth. Dust rose around them. The river murmured beside them. The stars traced their silent arcs overhead, while heaven and earth watched a mortal man fight not merely for survival, but for the truth of who he was. Hour after hour passed, and though Jacob's muscles trembled and his breath came ragged, he refused to yield. This was not Esau. This was not Laban. This was someone greater, and Jacob clung to him with the desperate strength of a man who knew that this was his final test, the turning point of his entire existence. But then, in a moment so effortless it felt almost gentle, The stranger reached out and touched Jacob's hip, and instantly the joint tore from its socket with a burst of searing pain. Jacob collapsed, unable to stand. Yet even as agony shot through his body, he refused to release his grip. His strength was gone, his body broken, yet something deeper than strength, something that had been forming inside him from Bethel to Haran to this very night, rose to the surface. The stranger spoke, his voice calm and commanding. "Let me go, for the dawn is breaking." But Jacob, grimacing through the pain, holding on with fingers trembling yet unyielding, answered with a sentence that echoed through the ages. "I will not let you go unless you bless me." It was a confession and a surrender. It was defiance and faith intertwined. It was the heel grabber reaching not for advantage, but for God Himself. And in that single, brutal, beautiful refusal to let go, Jacob revealed the deepest truth of his heart. After a lifetime of grasping for blessings by deception, by strategy, by force, he finally understood that the blessing he needed could come only from the one he now held in his arms. The stranger asked him, "What is your name?" And Jacob, limping, sweating, broken, whispered the truth. Jacob. That name carried decades of meaning. Deceiver, supplanter, grasping one, the man who took what was not his. To speak it aloud was to confess his entire life. Then the stranger spoke again, and his words shattered the night. "Your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel, for you have struggled with God and with men, and have prevailed." In that moment, the battlefield of the night became the birthplace of a new man. The stranger, whom Jacob would later recognize as none other than God in human form, did not bless him because Jacob overpowered him. He blessed him because Jacob finally surrendered, finally clung not to deceit, but to divine mercy, finally fought not to escape God, but to be transformed by Him. As dawn spread its pale light across the horizon, the stranger blessed Jacob and vanished into the rising day. Jacob, now Israel, pulled himself upright, leaning heavily upon his staff, his hip still burning with pain. But the limp he carried was no longer a mark of defeat. It was the sign of a man who had met God face to face and survived. He named the place Peniel, saying, "I have seen God, and yet my life was spared." And as he crossed the river to rejoin his family, the sun rose behind him, casting long beams of gold across a man who was no longer deceiver, no longer fugitive, but patriarch of a nation not yet born. He limped toward Esau, toward reconciliation, toward destiny. A new name, a new identity, a new covenant etched not into his skin, but into his soul. The night at the Jabbok was not merely the scene of a desperate man clinging to a mysterious visitor. It was the place where the veil between the physical and the spiritual thinned, until Jacob stood exposed before the one he had unknowingly pursued his entire life. What unfolded there was not a contest of strength, but a confrontation of souls, a divine collision between Jacob's old identity and the future God intended for him. No swords clashed, no armies roared. Yet the battle that took place in that darkness was weightier than any war Israel would later fight. For it was the war within a man, the war for a man, the war God Himself initiated to reshape the destiny of an entire nation. Jacob had spent his life fighting Esau for birthright, fighting Isaac for blessing, fighting Laban for justice, fighting circumstances to survive. But the opponent in the night was different. This was the God who had appeared at Bethel, the God of Abraham and Isaac, the God whose covenant ran like lightning through history. And the struggle revealed a truth Jacob had never faced. All his cleverness, all his scheming, all his grasping had brought him to the limits of himself. The real conflict was not external, but internal, the battle between Jacob's self-reliance and God's sovereignty, between his old identity and the new one waiting to be born. The turning point of the battle came not when Jacob displayed strength, but when he embraced weakness, when his hip was shattered, when he fell powerless to the ground, and yet refused to let go. In that moment, he did the one thing God had wanted from him all along. He surrendered without releasing his grip. That is why Scripture says he prevailed, not because he overpowered God, but because he finally yielded to him. The victory belonged not to Jacob's muscles, but to Jacob's brokenness. Then came the renaming, a divine act reserved only for those whose identity God himself rewrites. Your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel. With that proclamation, the deceiver died and a prince was born. The grasping heel holder became the father of a nation, and the man who once stole blessings by cunning now received one by grace. In Scripture, a name is not a label, but a destiny. Israel was more than a title, it was a transformation. The wound in Jacob's hip marked the death of the old man. The new name marked the birth of the covenant leader God had been shaping through every trial, every deception, every exile. The theological heart of this encounter lies in a revelation Jacob could never have learned from success, but only from divine struggle. True power does not come from cunning, possession, or control. It comes from God alone. The blessing Jacob sought his entire life was never something he could steal. It was something he could receive only when he stopped running, stopped scheming, stopped pretending, and finally clung to God with empty hands and a desperate heart. And so Israel walked away from the Jabbok, limping, yet stronger than he had ever been. A man wounded, yet blessed. Broken, yet restored. Humbled, yet exalted. For in God's kingdom, the ones who prevail are not those who stand tall, but those who fall at his feet. Not those who hide their weakness, but those who bring it into his presence. Not those who seize blessing, but those who cling to the giver. In that sacred wrestling match, Jacob discovered a truth that would echo through the faith of his descendants for millennia. To be transformed by God, a person must first be undone by him. When the dust of the Jabbok finally settled, and the first light of dawn rose over the wounded figure limping across the river, Jacob carried more than a new name. He carried a series of truths etched into his flesh, his spirit, and his destiny. Truths that speak not only to his transformation, but to the spiritual journey of every soul who dares to wrestle honestly with God. For what happened in that sacred darkness was not an isolated miracle, but a pattern, a revelation of how God forms his people through struggle, surrender, and grace. The first truth Jacob learned was the truth he had avoided all his life. Forgiveness cannot be seized. It must be received from the mercy of God. He had stolen Esau's birthright, deceived Isaac's blessing, manipulated circumstances to survive. Yet in the face of his brother's potential vengeance, he could do nothing but cast himself upon the compassion of heaven. Jacob's entire life had been built on his own cleverness. Yet at the riverbank, he discovered that forgiveness, true forgiveness, comes only from the heart of the one who governs human hearts. And so he clung to God, not because he was strong, but because he was desperate for mercy. The second truth rose from the long, bruising night of combat. God honors those who seek him with relentless persistence. Jacob did not win because he overpowered the heavenly figure. He prevailed because he refused to release the God he had spent a lifetime fleeing from. In his cry, "I will not let you go unless you bless me," we hear the heartbeat of faith that pleases the Lord. Not polished prayers or perfect obedience, but a stubborn, trembling determination to hold on to God even when every muscle screams to let go. Heaven values tenacity, and Jacob's tenacity became the gateway to his blessing. Third, Jacob learned what every believer must one day face. Identity is not something we craft for ourselves. It is something God bestows. The name Jacob had followed him like a shadow. Deceiver, supplanter, one who grasps. But in the presence of God, it was stripped away and replaced with Israel, a name that spoke of destiny, covenant, and divine intimacy. To receive a new name is to receive a new self. To meet God is to be remade by Him. Jacob limped out of the night, no longer defined by his past, but by the promise God had spoken over him. Fourth, Jacob discovered that closeness with God does not come through ritual, status, or inherited blessings, but through time, humility, and surrender. It was not in Isaac's tent, nor in Laban's fields, nor at Rachel's side that Jacob met God most intimately. It was in the solitude of wrestling, when every distraction had been stripped away, and his heart finally stood bare before the Almighty. Spiritual intimacy is not born in comfort. It is forged in the moments when we have nothing left to cling to but God Himself. Fifth, the wound in Jacob's hip, sharp, permanent, unforgettable, became a sacred sign. Weakness can carry the mark of divine transformation. Jacob's limp was not a punishment. It was a testimony. Every painful step reminded him that the blessing he carried did not come from strength, but from surrender. The world glorifies victory without wounds, but heaven glorifies wounds that lead to transformation. Jacob's limp preached a sermon his descendants would never forget. Finally, Jacob learned the paradox that lies at the heart of biblical faith. God uses our weakness to make our faith strong. He does not wait for us to become powerful. He meets us in our frailty. He does not demand perfection. He invites dependence. He does not crush the trembling. He blesses them. At the Jabbok, Jacob was broken so he could be healed, weakened so he could be strengthened, wounded so he could be reborn. And as he walked toward Esau with the rising sun at his back and a limp in his stride, Jacob carried the greatest truth of all. Those who cling to God in the night will walk into the morning transformed. The sun had barely lifted above the horizon when Jacob looked up and saw a sight that made his heart seize like a fist closing around it. Esau was coming, and with him 400 men, their silhouettes rising from the desert like a moving wall of judgment. Dust billowed behind them, glowing red beneath the dawn light, and every hoofbeat seemed to echo with the memory of Esau's ancient vow, "I will kill my brother Jacob." For a moment, the world narrowed into a single suffocating truth. This could be the end. The blessing he received, the name he carried, the limp he bore, all of it might lead him now into death. Jacob stepped forward anyway. He bowed once, and again, 7 times, each bow deeper than the last, each one a surrender of pride, a confession of guilt, a plea without words. Behind him, women and children waited in silence, the air heavy with uncertainty. Jacob's heart trembled, yet he advanced, the limp in his stride a reminder that he was no longer the man who once deceived his brother, but a man reshaped by the touch of God. And then the unimaginable happened. Esau broke into a run, not with sword drawn, not with hatred burning, but with tears already gathering in his eyes. Before Jacob could rise from his final bow, Esau reached him, threw his arms around him, held him, and wept. Two brothers who had once stood as enemies now clung to each other like men who had wandered too long in the wilderness of regret. The silence of decades shattered, not by accusations, but by sobs, raw, human, holy. The vengeance Jacob feared dissolved in the embrace he never expected. It was forgiveness so sudden, so overwhelming, that even the desert winds seemed to pause and watch. When Esau lifted his head and saw the women and children behind Jacob, wonder softened his voice. "Who are these with you?" Jacob answered with humility shaped by struggle. "They are the children God has graciously given your servant." And then came the gifts, the caravans of livestock Jacob had sent ahead like rivers of apology. Esau refused them at first. He had no need for reparations, for his heart had already released the anger that once ruled him. But Jacob insisted, not out of fear, but out of a deep, aching gratitude. "Please accept this gift, for seeing your face is like seeing the face of God." Because on that morning, Jacob understood something profound. What he witnessed in Esau's mercy was the reflection of the mercy God had shown him at the Jabbok. At last, the brothers parted, not as fugitives and pursuers, not as deceiver and victim, but as men at peace. Esau returned to Seir with lightness in his steps. Jacob continued toward Canaan with the weight of grace upon his shoulders. When he arrived in the land, Jacob purchased a small piece of ground near Shechem, pitched his tents, and built an altar, a monument not to his cleverness, nor to his survival, but to the God who had carried him from exile to reconciliation. He named it El Elohe Israel, God, the God of Israel. Not the God of the deceiver, not the God of the fugitive, but the God of Israel, the man reborn through struggle, restored through mercy, and reconciled through a love too powerful to be broken by time or sin. The final chapters of Jacob's life unfold not in triumphal splendor, but in a landscape woven with grief, longing, and the quiet faithfulness of a God who never abandoned him. Though he had wrestled with angels, though he bore a name carved by divine encounter, Jacob was not spared the sorrows that accompany the journey of mortal men. His story, even in its twilight, continues to echo the truth that the path of faith is not sheltered from pain, but strengthened by the presence of the one who walks beside us in it. The first great wound of Jacob's later years came with the death of Rachel, the woman he had labored 14 years to marry, the love of his youth, the anchor of his heart. She died giving birth on the road, her final breath mingling with the cry of the infant she delivered. And Jacob buried her not in a grand tomb, but beside the dusty road to Bethlehem, marking the place with a pillar as simple as it was sacred. Every journey he made afterward carried the ache of her absence. No wrestling match had broken him as deeply as the silent stillness of Rachel's grave. Then came an even darker sorrow, the loss of Joseph, the son of Rachel, the child in whom Jacob saw the spark of destiny. When Joseph's blood-stained robe was placed into his trembling hands, Jacob's spirit collapsed beneath a grief too heavy for words. He tore his garments, wrapped himself in sackcloth, and declared that he would go down to the grave, mourning his son. For decades he lived with the haunting belief that Joseph had been torn to pieces, never knowing that the boy he loved was alive in a foreign land, rising from slavery to a throne he could not yet imagine. And still, Jacob pressed on. Old age found him in Egypt, far from the land promised to his fathers, far from the soil where Abraham and Isaac had walked with God. He was a foreigner once more, a pilgrim in a land not his own, sustained only by the memory of God's covenant and the fragile hope that the story of Israel did not end in exile. Yet in that strange land, Jacob witnessed something only God could orchestrate. Joseph restored, Joseph exalted, Joseph alive. A son resurrected, a family reunited, a promise kept. As Jacob stood before Pharaoh, leaning on his staff, he described his years as few and difficult. Yet underneath those words lay a profound recognition. Through every deception, every exile, every heartbreak. God had been shaping him into the patriarch of a nation that would one day bear his God-given name, Israel. Jacob's wounds had become windows through which grace entered. His limp became a testimony. His losses became the soil from which God grew redemption. In the end, Jacob died as a man transformed, not by comfort, but by encounter, not by victory, but by wrestling, not by escaping struggle, but by being reshaped through it. His journey whispers the same invitation to every generation that reads his story. Wrestle with God, and you will not leave unchanged. Cling to him, and he will give you a new identity. Surrender your strength, and he will fill you with his. Jacob teaches us that forgiveness begins with mercy, that intimacy with God begins with brokenness, that perseverance in seeking him is honored in heaven, and that the marks left by struggle can become the very signs of blessing. And so the question turns gently toward us. Where do you need forgiveness? Where do you need courage to cling to God through the night? Where must pride yield to humility, or fear to faith? Where is God inviting you to wrestle, not to destroy you, but to transform you? Jacob's life ends, but his lesson remains. In the hands of God, the struggle becomes the pathway to blessing. Weakness becomes strength, and a wandering man becomes a nation.